Hello, Jane Freeman and Kerrie Davies. Thank you for joining me this morning to talk about my Algologies project, and particularly this issue of the role of women in science and the way that the Victorian seaweed collectors were kind of pioneers for this as women in science, particularly focusing on Mary Philadelphia Merrifield, the Brighton seaweed collector and pioneer who stomped across the rocks in the local area to collect the seaweed, which then went into the Natural History Museum and in the Booth Museum. And she wrote her book in 1864, a sketch of the natural history of Brighton, which led to her becoming fascinated, particularly in seaweed, and going on to actually write a paper for Nature. We also talked about the idea that, Queen Victoria was a seaweed collector as well. So it was a very well recognized thing for women to be able to do it. In fact, it was the only form of science that women would normally kind of partake in. And even Anna Atkins, the pioneering cyanotype photographer who published the first ever book of photographs, she published a book of photographs of seaweed. So these algologists, or as it's now known, phycologists, were the precursors in a way of you, and as women in science. And I wondered what your perspectives were on that, particularly around, how is it now? How have we moved from that time to now? Have we done enough? Or are women there? Do we have an equal role, or does more need to be done?
I think there's always more needs to be done, but I find it phenomenal how far we have come actually in the last 100 years. And I often think back to my own grandmother who had to leave school at 13 to look after the boys in her household, when she would really love to have become a maths teacher. Um, and the choices that we now have available to us are very different to the choices that were available to those early women scientists and to women in general. And I see in my kind of 20 plus year career how that has even changed in that timeline, with much more funding available for people to come back to work after taking a break to care for children or to have maternity leave or to care for other people. Um, that has really changed in the recognition that the roles of men and women are becoming less box defined, if you know what I mean. So I
Yeah,
think
I
I think
think
we've come an awful long way, but further to go.
yeah, I'd agree with that, and I think we have come a long way. And if I take our own field, so we are healthcare scientists, and actually the at graduate level and the sort of the entry level for biomedical scientists particularly is dominated by women. It's a profession that has a very large number of women in it. But what's interesting is that as you go up the grades, or as you go up in seniority, the percentage of women actually drops. And so I think entry into science and women being scientists has really, really improved. But where we have room to change is in leadership. So leaders in science is actually an area where there really does need to be a bit more emphasis and input to kind of show that you can be a leader in a field and be a mother. You can be a leader in a field and be a carer for elderly parents. You can be a leader in the field and just be a woman. That's totally fine. And I think that's kind of the areas that we kind of need a bit more help in.
Hmm. It's
I'd
interesting.
agree with that.
Yeah, it's interesting because in the past as well, I've read a lot about sort of women in science and the history of women in science, and a lot of the time the women in science were doing the main body of the work, but it was published under their husbands' names. So I mean, it didn't happen with Marie Curie so much, but with most other females in science, it was like this, and I'm reminded of I think it's Fanny Hess, who was the person to suggest that agar, the seaweed based jelly that ties all this project together, which is now predominantly used. It's a Chinese dessert, as I'm sure you know, but as it's now predominantly used in labs around the world to grow bacteria on. And in fact, it revolutionized and continues to revolutionize microbiology, and these agar recipes are improved and improved. The science behind it is incredible, with these dyes and diagnostic things that are in it. But she was the first person to suggest this, and I think when I was first told the story, it was all about her, you know, having a hobby in Chinese cookery, and she was the wife of a lab person, but actually she was one of the lab people working with Robert Koch. And she suggested, I think it's in about the 1880s, wasn't it? That she suggested that he use agar jelly instead of gelatin, the animal gelatin, not because of veganism or anything like that, but because it will, you boil it up and then it sets, and then can be heated up to about, I think, about 50, 60 degrees again. So you can grow bacteria on it, whereas gelatin would just melt and kind of suck the bacteria back in and kill it. So it's interesting to think about, you know, like the recognition of that work, because it's so important. It's almost as important a discovery as, you know, what Robert Koch was actually doing with it, studying anthrax and studying tuberculosis and things like that. This discovery has gone on to kind of revolutionize the whole field. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that's a really good example of sort of women being there and doing what's fundamental. So that part is actually a fundamental part of microbiology, and quite often it was the women in the background doing those fundamental bits that were really important, that actually then allowed this other amazing science to come along and go on the top of it and be published and you know, win awards even. But actually without those fundamentals, that never would have happened. But as you say, they were working in the labs, they weren't getting any recognition for that. And I think we've hopefully moved a long way from that time, and but I think it's really important now to kind of recognize that and talk about those people and say this was a fundamental thing that they did and changed all of microbiology for us.
Yeah, definitely. And if you know the history of antibiotic discovery, there's an awful lot of women who are performing that fundamental role in partnership with the men who were perhaps leading the lab or had more senior roles, but were doing that fundamental role, and perhaps today would have been recognised in a more formal way for their work. Yeah, and I think that went on a lot, particularly in the early part of the 20th century as we came into the antibiotic era. And it's great that we now see women leading research groups and you know, winning major recognition for their work. But as Kerrie said, the bottleneck for women at the moment in science is the senior role position. It's, you know, I heard someone describe it as we just drop off a cliff. And I think, you know, society has changed, and it is, you know, women do work more, they juggle childcare and they juggle other caring responsibilities with work, and that is becoming more the norm for men too, but it's still quite different at the moment.
I say that because it's also, I mean, these things is like the women are talking about, you know, making space for the caring roles, but that's something that men often need to do as well. And you know, so it's that's the thing with, you know, this sort of perspective on things, is to allow everyone to kind of flourish in their,
yes, absolutely,
ways. I was going to also say, I mean, women doing quite well in science, but maybe not reaching those upper roles in the UK. But that's not distributed around the world in the same way, is it? So women in science in other countries may struggle more or less, and there's different kind of issues in different countries as well, isn't there?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
there are
definitely
different
agree with that.
barriers.
Yeah, there's so particularly in some other countries, it's much more that it's more that fundamental role in the lab that they're playing. They're doing the work, but there's not the recognition of them doing the work, or developing it, or leading it, or having the ideas. So in some areas that is still the case. I think in some areas women are really celebrated, and actually they're doing a lot better than we are in the UK. So there is a very diverse kind of picture of how it looks for women in science, I think.
Yeah, and also different subjects have different distributions as well, and the kind of the biological stuff has historically been more acceptable from an earlier point. Case in point being the algologists, that it was much more acceptable for women to study things like that, or botany, things like that. Much less acceptable to study chemistry and God forbid, physics or maths. That is changing, but I think programs like WISE, the Women into Science and Engineering, and all the STEM initiatives really highlight that there is still a need to promote those subjects and make them attractive, and make it normal for women to want to go into them, in the same way that that men are now coming into the nursing and caring professions, and that they should be available to them. So it's making all of the professions and all of the subjects accessible and acceptable to everybody, I think.
What are some of these initiatives, if people wanted to look them up, if they're seeing this video, some of these initiatives to bring women into the sort of STEM fields and stuff like that? Can you name some of those initiatives?
I think the WISE is probably the most well known. So the Women in Science and Engineering kind of, I don't know whether it's a foundation, or I don't know how to describe it, but it is a program is probably the best way to describe it, that runs different projects, outreach to girls in schools or in sixth form, supporting women to do to learn leadership skills and how to promote themselves in the workplace, because we are often not as good at stepping forward and and blowing our own trumpets. So it's how to do that. So they support you by mentoring you, and there's lots of different things that they do to support you in lots of different ways. And the Chief Scientific Officer, Dame Sue Hill, has partnered with them to make a WISE CSO course, and you can apply to it and do this course, which is all about leadership in science. So there are initiatives like that. There are other charities as well, and other foundations that do similar things, but WISE is the big one, I think.
Yeah. And I mean, for healthcare scientists, coming back to the Chief Scientific Officer, we have national awards now for healthcare scientists to really promote sort of across the board for healthcare scientists. But women have been very successful in those awards, actually, and we're getting better at putting ourselves forward. As Jane said, we're a bit rubbish about going, do you know what, I've done something really well, and I'd quite like someone to say well done. So it's sort of going for those sorts of things, and helping that, actually providing that sort of role model ability to kind of go, look, someone else has done this and it's really good, and it's okay to say that they're really good. So there's a lot of that sort of thing as well.
I'm asking about women in science, but women in art, that's got all the same issues, if not worse, actually. The sort of at the higher things, like museum collection level, the percentage of women's tiny, and going back in history, I mean, women in art history have all but been wiped out, really. They're barely known. So there's very few kind of role models of women being very, very successful in art. There's no, it's difficult to say who would be the female equivalent of Picasso or something like that. And those kind of questions are quite difficult. We can look back at people like Frida Kahlo, but in her lifetime then she didn't have these same levels of success as now. Her husband was considered, Diego Rivera was considered to be the, you know, the great mural painter and the famous artist of the two. In fact, there's this meme that kind of does the rounds on social media, that says something like, "Wife of famous muralist dabbles in painting," was a headline apparently. So it is interesting to kind of look at both the fields and these fields that I've decided to kind of engage with, just to make my life difficult, I suppose. Talking of role models, so we have kind of have a somewhat of a lack of women at the highest levels of role models in science, and I'm thinking of the big organizations, you know, places like the Wellcome or the Crick and things like that. They're all led by men. There's also role and female role models, so we're thinking about that, but also role models from other diverse backgrounds that we might be lacking in science in the UK and around the world. And could you speak a tiny bit about that?
Yeah, so we know that intersectionality is a big issue. So we know that not only do women not get well represented in science, but ethnic minorities or anyone from an ethnic background may not do particularly well. Disability is another one. And actually, if you combine any of those, so intersectionally, if you are a woman of colour who is disabled, you are very, very underrepresented. So
ways like Frida Kahlo.
Yes, exactly. So I think it's that kind of it's the barriers are in place for every single group, but when you combine those groups together, it's so difficult. And so I think again, it's enabling people to have the options that everybody has. So making it as broad accessible as absolutely possible, but also having those role models in place to say it is possible, because people don't tend to try and attain something they think can't be done for them, and it's, you know, they need to see someone in that position to go, I can do that too. So there's something about needing to be trailblazers as well, and being a trailblazer can be quite hard, but you know, there's something very rewarding about being a trailblazer as well. The fact that you can be doing something pioneering that is helping others that will come along behind you, and that you make sure that pathway stays for them. You're not doing it just for you, you're doing this for other people in the future as well. So sort of encouraging people to put a step forward and go into the unknown slightly, I think, and supporting them to do that would be really good.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, definitely. There's something I thought of then and I can't remember what it was now. I think in terms of actual role models, it's, you know, it's, as Kerrie was saying, having people up there is great. I'm kind of minded to think about Margaret Thatcher here, in the fact that she was the first woman prime minister, and that's a huge moment. But in terms of women following her, I don't know how good she was at leaving the ladder down and encouraging people to climb up it. And that is really, really important, is if you have managed to attain a high position and you are unusual in that, is reaching down and helping those other people up. That's a very, very important thing to do. And in terms of disabilities as well, and ethnic minorities, making them visible. And for us in science, you know, sometimes we're largely funded by applications to large grant awarding bodies or whatever, and there are often quite strict stipulations around things, around how you make training packages, for example, if you're going for a fellowship, that don't always work for everybody, and flexibility really needs to be brought in to address that. So, for example, I'm a single parent, and I can't go off and do large training courses, and I can't move around, which is very much encouraged for early career researchers. They'd like you to move institutions. I can't do that. I'm not willing to do that to advance my career, because I have caring responsibilities and children at school. So building in the flexibility for that particularly would help, I think, women who have responsibilities, and people with disabilities or ethnic minorities who have different cultural needs. Just being a bit more understanding and flexible. And I think organisations like NIHR, the National Institute for Health Research, have really moved on things like that and have really listened to people about that and are building flexibility into their programs. And that's very important for women and men going forwards as well.
It's interesting because these are similar debates that are happening in the art world as well. So it's obviously something that brings together the art and science communities, because I mean, I always think they're quite fused anyway. But this is my perspective on the world. They're very similar kind of communities, and that's why the dialogue's great between them. But it's interesting to think about the similarities and to think about these kind of trailblazers that you mention. And I'm reminded of Mary Philadelphia Merrifield sharing all her methodologies for collecting seaweed and encouraging so many women into that kind of that hobby, I guess, at the time. But as somebody as she managed to write for Nature and everything, really, and have a seaweed actually named in her honor by another seaweed expert. It's kind of amazing to think about, her back then getting into nature and all this from an interest, from a love, and she came from the arts. She was a history of fashion person before she got into seaweed. So I found all that fascinating. So I think I'm going to take that story about the idea of the trailblazer forward and see what we can do with this seaweed, and see if I can encourage other people to look at seaweed and microbiology and think about women in science and all those threads together. I'm going to be attempting to make my own agar during this process from the British seaweed. Apparently is vaguely possible, but not very easy. And things like that, and growing the bacteria from the local area and things. So I'll be sharing some microbiology things through this, as well as some seaweed things and women in science. So that'd be the next steps. And thank you so much for joining me in this interview.
Absolute pleasure.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Anna.
Thanks.